A family in Long Island is suing two separate funeral homes after a mix-up led to a completely different man being buried in their father's grave. And they only found out even a hint of something at the viewing, an open casket viewing, where they saw that the man in their father's favorite Led Zeppelin T-shirt, which is how he wanted to be buried, was did not have a mustache, even though their dad did. And despite them thinking that something was up, the funeral home said, "No, it's okay. That's your dad. That's just something that happens with embalming. He's good to rock on forever down in his casket." They went ahead and buried him. And then a few weeks later, they got a call from another funeral home saying, "Oh, we've got your dad still here in South Carolina." So now they're seeking $60 million in emotional distress damages for having to go through all that and having to, have their father buried improperly and not according to Jewish tradition, which required him to be buried promptly rather than sitting around in South Carolina for weeks and almost getting cremated. This is a news story about the lawsuit, and it walks us through a little bit of what allegedly happened here, frankly, in more detail than the lawsuit does. So you can see that they say that these sisters filed $60 million lawsuit when the wrong man was allegedly buried in their father's grave wearing his beloved Led Zeppelin t-shirt. And that they said that they basically, when they viewed the body, there were these red flags because there's no mustache. Their father had mustache for decades until his death, and we'll see that mustache down here as well as his favorite Led Zeppelin t-shirt. So he was rocking this in life, and he wanted, to be buried forever with his favorite band. And Led Zeppelin's a great band, so I'm not, if you're going to go out with a band, that would be my vote. But the funeral home tells them when they sort of raise, like, hey, what's going on with this? Why doesn't he have a mustache? The funeral home is just like, and there's two of them. So the New York one is like, whatever, this isn't an issue. We got the right body from these guys in South Carolina. We're fine. Here's the dad again. Here's the two sisters suing. And so they have this Jewish tradition that he's supposed to have a speedy funeral, which means you don't just sort of leave him lying around. But apparently he had been lying around for 3 weeks. They get a call 3 weeks later from this South Carolina funeral home that's like, we've got your dad. It's actually some other dude, a random person just buried in your dad's t-shirt in his grave, and you had a funeral with just some guy. And they basically said he was supposed to be flown out. They were about to cremate the guy, and then they look and they're like, oh, that's not, this is not whoever the other person is. We don't know that. The stranger still has the favorite T-shirt, so they did bury their dad again at a different plot. He did not get to wear his favorite band shirt, and they're kind of like, why? What is going on? Like, why is this other person here? Our whole funeral is ruined. Which, yes, that would ruin it. And one of these funeral homes decided to issue a statement saying, the family confirmed this was him, so it's their fault. Essentially, they don't actually say that, but it's heavily implied. And so that is what the news article says. Now let's look at the lawsuit and see what they say about this, because there's an interesting legal claim. As a lawyer, I've never really heard of even this legal claim that they're suing under, but it is a claim for what happens if a body, basically for this exact situation. Sometimes there are very rare laws that are very rarely used. Okay, here's a copy of the lawsuit. And the lawsuit, it's filed in Suffolk County in New York. That's a state court. It doesn't give a lot of details compared to what we'd already seen in the news articles. You can go read those if you want more. The one we were looking at was the New York Post, but there's a bunch of different places that have said the same thing and sort of talked about it. The lawsuit itself is, I'd say, sparse factually, but it does get into this interesting way that you can actually sue people if you get into this same situation. Something I'd never heard of. It's a pretty rare and certainly rarely used that I know about cause of action. But generally, like, you get in these situations and there's always going to be some attorney doing anything people can be sued on. There's probably a specialist, which makes me think that there probably is a specialist in suing people over stuff happening to their relatives' dead bodies. And what is this cause of action? Well, first of all, what is a cause of action? A cause of action is a legal theory under which you can sue someone. So they usually have a checklist of elements. You have to check every one of the elements. And if you do, then in that situation, you have a right to sue someone under that theory. What is this theory called? It's called loss of sepulcher. And if you don't know what sepulcher is, that just means kind of like a burial, like a place of burial or method of burial or whatever. And not a commonly used word either, and so, for most people. And so, and me too. So what is loss of sepulcher as a legal theory? Well, this is something that's actually been developed over time specifically to deal with what happens when people's relatives' dead bodies are interfered with, which I guess, unfortunately, that means it's common enough that over a long period of time, so many judges have dealt with this that there's a checklist. So how does right of sepulcher work? This is a New York case that deals with how the law works there in New York for this very rare, but apparently very common a way to sue someone. So this is a legal case. A legal case is where a judge is sort of writing out an opinion about what happened there. This is another case, I guess, that involved someone's next of kin having their their body messed with. And this explains this whole claim. It says it is well established that the common law right of sepulcher gives the next of kin the absolute right to the immediate possession of a decedent's body for preservation and burial. That's the first part of the sentence. Well, what does all this mean? So in law school, I had to do a bunch of flashcards just to memorize all the words like this. So what are these different words if you haven't heard of them? Common law is this concept where over time, if judges start encountering the same scenario again and again and again, then judges will write a bunch of opinions separately, but then over time they kind of get collected, and I'm talking like back to Roman days or whatever sometimes, but they will have these checklists or these rules or whatever that they come up with after so many judges have looked at it. Everybody gradually starts agreeing, yeah, that was a good decision, that was a good decision, and then it becomes what we call common law, which is the law that most people agree on. It's different by state, but they'll all kind of generally address the same types of situations, and this is New York's version of loss sepulcher. So they when it says the next of kin, that just means whoever's like the closest relative to the person. So in this case, the daughters are the next of kin, they're the closest. If you had cousins or something, they would be further away in terms of like the closest of relation. And actually, if you get off into like you don't have daughters, you don't have cousins, you don't have brothers or parents, there's law that maps out on the family tree who's going to be the closest and who's going to have this. But there will be someone who will be next of kin. That person will have this right of sepulcher. And that is the right to the immediate possession, which means you get to take control of the body and do what you want with it for preservation and burial. Presumably within limits, there's going to be laws about that too, but we won't get into that. And those, but you do have the right to decide like how's my next of kin, how's my dad going to get buried? That's a right that you have. If your dad has like whatever he wants to do, and you're the one who kind of controls that once you have this right of sepulcher. And the second sentence says that damages will be awarded against any person who unlawfully interferes with that right or improperly deals with the decedent's body. These are two separate things. You kind of know that because it says or. So what's the first one that they could do? They could unlawfully interfere with that right, which means someone, in any way that's illegal goes or that they don't have a right to do, just sort of messes around with your right to bury them. They take the body, they do whatever. They, cremate someone when you wanted them, buried in a or whatever you wanted to do that was different from it. But if they're not legally allowed to do it and they do it, then that's a violation. Or if they improperly deal with the decedent's body. So that's kind of really what applies here, because you have funeral homes. They did, give the body to the funeral homes. I don't think the funeral homes were acting illegally. They were just acting kind of stupidly, I guess, by keeping the body in South Carolina and sending some random other person up to be buried in his favorite Led Zeppelin shirt. So, whatever the next part of this is this list of 6 elements, and those are the checklist of 6 things they have to prove in order to be able to win this kind of claim against the funeral homes. So this list of 6 things, because it says, if you kind of look at it at the end, it says and, that means you have to meet all 6 if you're going to win a claim against someone for doing this. So what are the 6 elements? First is plaintiff is the decedent's next of kin. The decedent is the person who died. So you got to show, yeah, I'm the closest person to them. There should be a 2 here. I think this is a typo because they jumped to 3. But the second element is plaintiff had a right to possession of the remains, which means you've got to show you were the one who had the right to have like the legal custody of the body, and you get to decide which funeral home it goes to, what they're going to do with it, whatever. Third element is that the defendant interfered with the plaintiff's right to immediate possession of the decedent's body, which means they have to have just somehow messed around with your legal right to have this possession of the person's body and decide what to do with it. Fourth, the interference was unauthorized. So, for example, here, that means basically like if, let's say they'd said, oh, yeah, you can just take some random guy and stick him in my dad's shirt, and yeah, I'm cool with that. Dad would have loved it, or whatever. Or maybe they just didn't like their dad or something. I'm not talking about them, but like hypothetically, let's say it's someone who didn't like their dad and was just like, man, I just want to get him, and they authorized it, or whatever reason they did. Even if they were just like, it really doesn't matter why they did it. If they authorized the funeral home to do this, then you can't sue. Here, that does not look like it was the situation that this absolutely was not authorized, and they, the funeral home may say, oh, well, because they identified it as the dad, and like they did in the press release, and say, oh, they could say you did authorize it, but if they were really being told, hey, yeah, no, that's your dad, it's fine, don't worry about it, that probably isn't real authorization because they were sort of doing it after a factual misrepresentation. The next element, the fifth element, is that the plaintiff was aware of the interference, which means that The you have to get damages on this kind of lawsuit. You have to basically know at some point that something happened to the body of your loved one, and that makes sense if you think about it. Like, why would you have damage if you never find out about it? Then you're not really emotionally damaged, which is the sixth element here, which is that the interference caused plaintiff mental anguish, which is generally presumed. What does that mean? So you can sue people basically whenever you suffer emotional distress or mental anguish. That just means you sue for the value, the damage to you of having had that mental suffering. Now here they're suing for $60 million. Well, they say that it's presumed here, and that which is presumed means that you generally the jury and the judge assumes that there was some level of mental anguish. Will they get the full $60 million? Which is probably what everyone is asking. I'm sure some people are thinking, man, I wish my dad would get replaced by some imposter and get put on his favorite T-shirt, and I could sue for $60 million. Some people are not, but I am sure they're, a lot of people watch these videos on YouTube. So you would not presume the full 60 million. Okay, you would presume that there is some damage, but that could be a dollar. But in terms of proving was there damage emotionally, that would be just that would be assumed unless there's evidence otherwise, that the funeral home could come up with proof that, like, oh, these daughters, and again, this is hypothetical. So I'm not saying this is true here, but if there was a situation where it was someone who buried their father and they hated their father, or they were like celebrating and thought it was great or whatever, um, you could rebut the presumption, is what they call it. You could offer that evidence to show, no, these people didn't care about their family member or whatever. Again, not talking about these people. I'm talking about hypotheticals, not these specific people. But 60 million. So as a lawyer, and I do have a little experience, even though I'm not barred in New York, I have a little experience with cases that have involved New York law on emotional distress. So in New York, they have this kind of benchmark, is what they call it, which is like a guideline for the judge on what you should do with emotional distress. If it's so, what they say is, if it's your own testimony only that you offer, like, let's say I'm the one testifying, I say I suffered distress and I offer testimony like, what was it like? Like, look, I cried for days and I had sleepless nights or whatever, and like this just like ruined me for 3 weeks or whatever, whatever I testify to. You can get damages up to 100,000 ish. They don't make a hard limit, but they're like, it's roughly in that range. After some judges had gone through like every case they could find of emotional distress in New York, and said that's generally where kind of the stopping point is for just your own testimony. If you want to get more than that, you usually in New York have to show psychiatric records, show that you were treated, show that there's some kind of medical issue, something more serious than just your own testimony. They could do that here. That might have happened. I don't know. But I will tell you just kind of a gut feeling, which is that as a lawyer, 60 million probably won't fly. I think for these facts, I think it would probably get cut down by an appellate court. I think that could they make 1 million? Could they make something over that? Maybe, because this is kind of like a very like extreme situation to just take some random person and bury him as your dad. Like that's probably something that probably this specific thing doesn't happen a lot. Would it cause them distress? Yes. I think courts generally would consider it excessive if they got up to the 60 million level. So probably not going to win that much, but I do think that they kind of, the funeral homes probably will be settling for something, because this is a little nuts that this happened or was allowed to happen. So if you want to see more videos like this about crazy lawsuits, hit subscribe, or you can hit one of the end cards floating around and see another video popping up in the queue.